Hello, everybody. I hope you're having a good Monday. Here in Early, it was the first day of school, so I hope all of you students, teachers, and faculty and everybody had a great first day. I was thinking about earlier, going back to school, I was thinking about planting trees. I'm not sure how those things wove together, but I'm sure they must have somehow. But there was a lesson that was in common that I want to share with you tonight. It's one that has helped me a lot in life and in ministry, and I think it's helpful to everybody. When you go to plant trees, or really a bush or any kind of plant like that, you have to think, especially if you're planting in groups, about what the future is going to be like. You have to plan for future growth. And so when you plant trees together, you can't just put them together like 2 or 3 feet apart. That's like a newbie's mistake, and probably most people at some point in their life have done this. You plant these trees too close together, or you plant too many tomato plants, or whatever it is, and they crowd each other out. It actually becomes unhealthy because you didn't plan for growth. You planted that tree, that bush, that tomato plant based on your impression of its current size. But I didn't think about, what's it going to be like in 20 years? What's it going to be like in 5 years? What's going to be like in 50 years if you're talking about a pecan tree or something like that? And you actually have to plant with room for all that future growth. We're not always really good about that when we start talking about relationships and how we view each other. And it comes into play as you go back to school. We were talking with our kids about how when you go back to school, don't just assume that everybody is going to be exactly the same as they were last year. If there was a classmate you had a problem with, 6 months ago when you got out 6 months ago for spring break, or somebody that you've known as an adult for 20 years, don't just assume that they are what they were when you saw them last. Give people room to grow, kind of like that tree. They've been steadily growing, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and some never quite grow up. But honestly, people who never grow in 20 years, that's kind of sad. That's called immaturity. And after that amount of time, it gets pathetic. But most people do grow. They get better at varying rates and everything else, but people get better. And maybe that's just the optimistic side of things in me, but I do believe that I'm a preacher. If I don't believe people can get better, what in the world am I doing? So anyway, you plan for growth, and you go into relationships, again, renewing relationships with people you haven't seen in months or years, understanding that maybe they're not quite the same as they used to be, and that's hopefully a good thing. Just like planning ahead growth in a tree or a bush or a shrub, all that kind of stuff. Like I say, we're not always good at that. Jesus visited in Luke chapter 7, toward the end of the chapter, I think 36 to 50. He is a guest at a Pharisee's house, and a lady comes in who has a past. And one of the Pharisees leans over and whispers to one of the other people at the table and says, if this guy were really a prophet, he'd know what kind of a woman, what kind of a sinner she really is. In other words, he wouldn't have anything to do with her because he would know what kind of person she is. That kind of attitude is the kind of thing that we're actually trying to make sure our kids don't grow up thinking and don't grow up saying. We want them to give their neighbors, their fellow students, room for growth. That maybe over these last several months, things might be better than they left them. And if things were good, maybe now they're great. If things were bad, maybe now they can heal. What if we adults set an example for our kids to not freeze people in a bad impression, but instead taught them that we're always going to expect of people growth? Generally, people live up to expectations anyway. But what if we started to think about people in the past not always as, I knew them 30 years ago and they were a jerk. Well, here's the problem with that. Sometimes they grow and you don't. I've had that problem. When I was in junior high, and this is why I teach my kids this lesson, when I was in junior high, in the 7th grade, there were a couple of people that really, they were snobby, snooty jerks. I'm not talking bad about them because this is not who they are now, but that is what they were. And I just flat didn't like them. I've always been kind of allergic to snootiness and stuff like that, and I just don't like it. And here's the problem with that, though. So then about a year and a half later, obviously a different grade, year and a half later, at the end of the school year, I was standing in a line at an award ceremony in front of two of these people. And I had frozen them in my impression. And so I assumed that they were going to be snotty. I assumed they were going to be rude. I assumed they were going to be condescending. And they weren't. They were friendly. They were kind, even complimentary to me. But because I was so sure that they only knew how to be snotty, I assumed they were being sarcastic. I assumed that it was really a backhanded compliment. And I was wrong. And I'm 40, what am I now? 48 years old. I'm about to be 49, old enough to have to think about it. I'm 49. And that was the 8th grade. And I still regret that conversation because I responded not to what they were, but to what they had been. And then, in that moment, guess who was actually being the snotty jerk? You see? The problem is, when we freeze people in their past failures, we become the ones who become the losers. Good, gracious, godly people don't freeze people in their past impressions. Good, gracious, godly people, we have to learn sometimes the hard way, are those who give everybody else room to grow. We assume that over time they've gotten to be the bigger person. And what we need to make sure is that we have too, that we're growing and that we're becoming the bigger person, the better person, and that we show grace and that we always make sure we've given God room to make somebody who may have hurt us in the past actually be a source of friendship and strength in the present and in the future, because that is real grace. God bless you and have a good night.